The war against ISIS in Raqqa has intensified this week, and thousands of civilians find themselves trapped in the crossfire. The United Nations says up to 25,000 civilians are still stuck in the city. Here's what they face.
These are the ruins of the city of Raqqa. The soldiers are driving through these lifeless roads to their post. They are in the middle of an intense gunfight with the Islamic State to reclaim the city. It has been more than 2 months since the US-backed forces launched a major offensive to reclaim the city, which many refer to as the crown jewel of ISIS. The battle has been bloody, with the ISIS firing under cover, making a counter-offensive even more difficult for the soldiers. The biggest concern, however, is fate of the civilians, stuck in the middle of the gunfire from all sides. Rights groups like Amnesty claim the battle has killed hundreds of civilians, and those who still remain in the city face greater risk. The United Nations believes that up to 25,000 civilians are still trapped in Raqqa.
On Syria, our humanitarian colleagues tell us they're deeply concerned by unconfirmed reports of a high number of civilians killed by airstrike in Raqqa city over the last 24 hours. These attacks, if confirmed, are a shocking reminder that civilians continue to bear the brunt of the conflict in many parts of Syria.
US and Russian-led forces have stepped up their offensive. The bombing from United States-led troops has intensified. Reports claim at least 100 civilians were killed this week in airstrikes. But it's not just the fighting. Amnesty says that ISIS has been using civilians as human shields. The United Nations estimates that more than 400,000 people have died so far in the war. The coalition forces say all possible precautions are being taken. Aid group Doctors Without Borders said food and medicine required to treat the wounded are in short supply. This offensive may end the rule of the caliphate in Raqqa, but at what cost? There are no easy answers. Bureau Report, WION.
And joining us this evening is Gareth Brown. He's a journalist currently in London, but he's reported from these parts. Good evening, Gareth. Good to have you on the show. How bad is the situation on the ground there, especially for the civilians who are caught in the crossfire?
Well, it's a pretty torturous situation, I think. It's kind of very similar to what we've seen across Iraq and other parts of Syria, Mosul. We see the same situation over and over again. It's really, really brutal fighting, whether it's the Iraqi government, the Syrian regime, or the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces fighting against ISIS. The fighting is really, really heavy, and often it takes place in very, very densely populated areas, and unfortunately civilians bear the brunt of that fighting.
Right. Someone once told me that these terror groups are like water. You bolt one end, you cap one end of the bottle, they'll flow somewhere else. So while they're talking about this offensive in Raqqa, is there a fear that they'll find another stronghold, and the fighting goes on and it comes at a huge cost of life?
Yeah, that's definitely a risk, that this kind of battle against ISIS could be some sort of whack-a-mole. I think the challenge always should have been, defeating ISIS sustainably with kind of local organic forces. And this is where we see, in Raqqa, we see the kind of unique risk that we haven't seen in battles against ISIS anywhere. The ground forces fighting in Raqqa are overwhelmingly Kurdish. They have small Arab contingents, but they're overwhelmingly Kurdish, and Raqqa is an Arab city. And there are real concerns that there could be some sort of kind of sectarian backlash. Now, we're not likely to know the true kind of extent of that until after the fighting's actually over and the dust kind of starts to settle. But, I mean, it's certainly a risk. They still hold a lot of ground in other parts of Syria. Deir ez-Zor, just to the south of Raqqa is another real kind of stronghold for them. And that's going to be the next big battle against ISIS. And then, of course, we see them popping up elsewhere, across the world, in the Philippines, in Libya. So yeah, it's this very, very difficult battle. That doesn't mean necessarily they don't need to be challenged on the ground. It's got to be a holistic approach to fighting them.
Gareth Brown, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for that update. And we are tracking the situation in Raqqa very closely.